أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. We're still continuing from the last lesson concerning what is not permissible for a person to do, يعني ويحرم عليه, and we're on the 19th matter now, starting from al-kadhibu wal-ghibatu, which was the first and the second, all the way down to the 19th matter, which is وَتَأْخِيرُ الصَّلَاةِ and أَوْقَاتِهَا, to delay your prayer until the time goes out. For example, yani a person waits until Maghrib to pray his Asr prayer, or a person who delays his Isha until Fajr. And we'll clarify this matter in the topic of that deals with, in the chapter that deals with the prayer times. But what is intended here is to let the mukallaf know that praying or delaying a prayer until the time goes out is haram, and it is from one of the kaba'ir, from the major sins, for a person to delay his prayer until the time goes out. So the very first thing that a person needs to establish in his religion in terms of actions, that is, after a person establishes his belief, he has to establish his prayers, because the prayer is what will keep his religion sound. If a person was to observe and look at the 5 pillars of Islam, the shahadatain, yani the shahada, the salah, the prayer, zakat, and hajj, and if a person was to look at these things, they would see that al-hajj and your shahada for entering Islam, or once in a lifetime for a person who is born a Muslim, are 2 acts that only have to be done, are 2 pillars of Islam that only have to be done once in your life. And if we look at fasting and zakat, then we see that these are 2 actions that only have to be done once a year. But if we look at prayer, this is an action that has to be done 5 times a day. So the Sharia indicates to the importance of the act, because if a person does not keep his prayers in order and on time, then it is difficult for a person to remember his Lord throughout the day, and therefore falls off his religion. So it is sufficient for the common day person, or for the common person, to focus on establishing his prayer before considering any other thing. For example, a person should take it as an achievement. For example, if a person finds that praying on time is difficult, it is enough of an achievement for him to pray all of his prayers on time, and that should be his first focus. Sometimes, as I witnessed on numerous occasions in the West, Muslims find difficulty praying. So when we find, and these are isolated, obviously. So when a person finds that they're in that state, then they should focus on establishing their prayers, and that only. Because until one establishes his prayers, all other actions in general will not be of much of benefit to him, because because the prayer is the thing that Allah has made obligatory on you, and they must be carried out. And cutting your prayers, meaning not to perform them or to pray them late, one cuts their rope and their relationship with Allah absolutely. So we see that delaying your prayer until the time goes out is a grievous sin and something that should be avoided. Then he goes on to say, وَلَا يَحِلُّ لَهُ صُحْبَةُ فَاسِقٍ وَلَا مُجَالَسَتُهُ لِغَيْرِ ضُرُورَةٍ. It is not permissible for him to keep the company of a fasiq, and it is not permissible to keep social intercourse with him or with them without necessity. Here the author is talking about keeping what we call a fasiq as a friend. What do we mean by fasiq? A fasiq is somebody who does sins, outward sins of disobedience outwardly and publicly. And this is what we consider a fasiq, a person who does sins outwardly and publicly. Yani fisq bil jawarih, yani doing acts, disobedient acts with the outward limbs of the body. For example, a person who does a lot of backbiting and does it publicly, or a person who smokes publicly or drinks publicly or keeps illegal relations with opposite sex publicly, or things within this like that are considered by in Islam to be sins. So here he mentions that it is not permissible to keep us, to have suhbah, meaning to keep companionship or friendship with a fasiq. Now that is the original rule, and that is the rule that remains. But we're living in a time where fisq is widespread due to the ignorance of the Sharia, or the ignorance of knowledge pertaining to the Sharia. So we have to keep things at a balanced perspective. If we say that every fasiq we shouldn't keep their company, then who's going to teach them their religion, or who's going to guide them? As we mentioned back in the beginning of the text, we mentioned about the obligation of making hijrah, of separating from a people, and we mentioned the conditions. Now the conditions of that, of separating from a person, as we mentioned, is that you fear that you don't have the ability to change him. That's the general rule. If you know or you think that you have the possibility to change that person, change that fasiq, then it is not permissible for you to leave that person. So our point here is that it's not permissible for you to keep the company of a fasiq. But once again, we have to keep in mind there's conditions. If we know that we have the ability to change that person, then we cannot leave them without trying our best to change their states. For example, you have a friend, both of you grew up and you were both Muslims, and he stopped praying, and you guys are best friends, you grew up with each other, you're like family. If he stops praying, you don't say, "Oh, Abdul Rahman, a'udhu billah, he became a fasiq, I'm gonna cut him off, I don't want to deal with him, he's not on the deen of Islam." This is not your Jews, because since he's your best friend, then in most cases you have the ability to change him, and it's wajib on you to keep his company and to try to change him. But it becomes wajib on you to separate from him if you find that you have no way of changing his state. Then you leave him, because the scholars mention, which is based on a hadith, is either going to be two ways. Either you're going to influence him, or he's going to influence you. If you're not influencing him, then he's influencing you, and there's no third option. So if you feel that you're changing his state, that you can bring him around to your house, and he's listening to what you're saying, then it's obligatory on you not to separate from him. But if you see that you cannot change him. For example, you're going to his house and you're talking to him, and he's listening to music and playing with his PlayStation. You're sitting there talking, and before you know it, you're picking up a controller to to play, and he's there, he's smoking, and the environment is not an environment that Allah is pleased with. Then you must separate from him because you're no longer beneficial to him. And that's what he means here. وَلَا يَحِلُّ لَهُ صُحْبَةُ فَاسِقٍ. As we mentioned, is a general rule, but there are conditions. So we have to make sure that our religion is balanced, and know how to not be lazy about our religion, but at the same time not to be extreme. And he says, وَلَا مُجَالَسَتُهُ لِغَيْرِ الدُّرُورَةٍ. And وَلَا مُجَالَسَتُ means social, to have social intercourse with a fasiq. What does that mean? Suhbah, friendship, is somebody that you're always with, right? Or somebody that you're generally with on a consistent occasions. And mujalasatu just means to keep general social gatherings. So for example, and it's one of the things that Muslims are faced with, and if Allah gives you tawfiq, inshallah you'll be able to avoid them, is a lot of the workplace and a lot of the social intercourse that goes in the workplace, like outings, like lunch outs with your colleagues. Usually when you go with your colleagues to restaurants, they drink alcohol, they smoke, they talk about the world, they talk about the things that are not permissible. In reality, these things are not permissible for you to attend, even if you consider them tied to your work, right? And a Muslim has to try his best to avoid these matters if he can. And I would say to avoid them altogether, because it's going to have an effect on you in the long run. So this is what we consider suhbatu. Wala mujalasatuhu, social intercourse. Or even this goes as far as Muslims who get married nowadays. You have a lot of men and women mixing, and possibly the after the wedding they have parties where the women and the man, they dance together. If you know that at this wedding impermissible things will take place, it's not permissible for you to attend these weddings. And furthermore, he mentions the ghayr durura. Now these things that we mentioned are without necessity, right? If there's a necessity for these things, then you must do it. Or not must to do it, then it's permissible to do it. For example, you're going to do a business deal with somebody. You're a salesman and you're going to make a business deal, and you go to the restaurant, and the man who is there is drinking and smoking. You go there, you sit with him, you talk about the business deal, you sign the contract, and you go. That's permissible because there's a need. So where there's a need, there's a way. There's an exception to the rule in the Sharia that where there's a need, then there's a way. But when there's no need, then no. Right? So this is what he means. لِغَيْرِ دُرُورَةٍ. It meant it's not permissible to do if there's no necessity to do so. So I assume that most people, as you mentioned, are affected by this and find it difficult to avoid social intercourses in workplaces. But if a person turns to Allah and asks Allah to make it easy, then Allah will find a way. But for those who accept it and go along with it and say it's for my work, then they won't find their ways out. They won't find their way out because they're satisfied with their position, and I can remember I had been working in Taiwan. I was working in Taiwan for about 4 years, and I can remember going for my job, and me and a few other brothers walked in to get a job. And I mean, this is probably the first time that they saw Westerners with big beards and so on and so forth. And mostly all the people who work inside of schools are women. So when they came in, they they put their hands up to shake our hands, and we said we don't shake the hands of women. And they looked at us like, where do you guys come from? Are you guys American? And we clarified to them, that we're Muslims, and the reason why we don't shake the hands of women. And one of the women actually said, well, you guys need to come, and our husbands need to come and meet you guys. And we found that after we mentioned to them that, they actually honored us. Like, they had no problem with us praying. I mean, when we were making wudu, some of the kids used to come and start making wudu with us. And even sometimes some of the teachers started to even recognize when our time for prayer comes. So when we're rushing to leave class, they're like, oh, you got time to pray? I mean, it's time for you to pray, right? Okay, you can go early, and I'll take over the class for you for the last 5 minutes. So when you honor the religion of Allah and you do things for the sake of Allah, Allah will put in the people's hearts to love you, whether they be Muslim or non-Muslim. But we have to stand for the religion of Allah, and then we will find the help of Allah. So, nas'Allah tawfiq, inshallah. And here he clarifies the point that we just mentioned by saying, وَلَا يَطْلُبُ رِضَاءَ الْمَخْلُوقِينَ بِسَخَطِ الْخَالِقِ. Yani, do not seek the pleasure of al-makhluqeen, meaning don't seek the pleasure of people, بسخط الخالق, يعني by the anger of Allah. Meaning don't seek the pleasure of people if it means that it's going to bring the displeasure or the wrath of Allah. And that's in accordance to what we just mentioned, that a person should not seek to please somebody if it means bringing the displeasure or the anger of Allah. Right? So we don't look, or we don't certify, impermissible acts or ugly acts, whether it be from Muslims or non-Muslims, for the sake that they may be pleased with what we do. For example, you work, you're working at a workplace, and you have to pray Asr and Dhuhr, and some work comes to your table, and maybe your supervisor asks you, can you just please get this work done before you pray? And you say, oh, no problem, ma'am, it's okay, I can pray later. La, because that is seeking the pleasure of people, in matters that bring the displeasure or the anger of Allah. So a person is supposed to say, sorry, excuse me, miss, or excuse me, mister, but I have to establish my prayer now, and then excuse me, give me 10 minutes, and I'll establish my prayer, and then I'll be right back, and I'll finish my work, no worries. And then you're gonna find that when you do that, that Allah will actually put in the hearts of those people to honor you. Why? Because although you put your prayer first, you finished your work, and that's what they wanted from you. So that's the hikmah, and that's a form of da'wah for the non-Muslims, huh? But then if you say, okay, miss, no problem, they're not gonna see. If you say, for example, you said, miss, no problem, I'll finish my work and I'll pray later, then they'll never see the way that Islam and the way that Muslims honor prayer. Right? So sticking to the religion of Allah and defending it in that way, by action, then Allah will open up doors for you and make your practicing your religion easier. So that's what he means. وَلَا يَطْلُبُ الرِّضَاءَ الْمَخْلُوقِينَ بِسَخَطِ الْخَالِقِ. In short, don't do anything that Allah is not pleased with for the sake of people, whether they be Muslims or are non-Muslims. And some Muslims are faced with that matter when they enter Islam. Their parents don't want them to wear hijab, or their parents don't want them to grow a beard. In most cases, the parents don't want that because of the fact of their dislike for your being a Muslim, or for the dislike of Islam, whether they tell you or they don't. Alright, because they'll never be pleased with you until you turn back on your religion. If, for example, you were a girl and you didn't accept Islam, but you just decided to tie up your hair out of style, your parents would probably never ask you why you did it, and they wouldn't care. But the fact that you said that I've become Muslim and I do it now, it becomes an issue. Or for a boy who was to grow his beard, out of a style. And I mean, maybe your mother would say, "Oh, why are you growing a beard?" Or your father would say, "Why are you growing a beard?" Say, "Oh, it's a new style." "Oh, it's a new style, no problem." But then say, "I'm growing my beard because I became a Muslim," and so on and so forth. Now all of the problems have began from here. So we have to understand that even in terms of our parents and our family, we cannot do things that make them happy if it means displeasing Allah or bringing Allah's anger. So we have to sometimes recognize that sacrifices are going to have to be made. And in support of that, he mentions an ayah from the Quran and a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ by saying, قال الله سبحانه وتعالى والله ورسوله أحق أن يرضوه إن كانوا مؤمنين. Allah and His Messenger have more rights that you please them in كانوا مؤمنين, if you are believers. Meaning, if you are believers, O people, if you are believers, then know that pleasing Allah and His Messenger is something that they have more rights to than anybody else. Then he says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. There is no obedience to people in disobedience to Allah.